So when I think about narrative, it's the underpinning of our entire society. It's how it shapes policy, it's how it shapes culture, it's how we are communicating our values at the individual level as families, as a community. I often say this quote, "You are what you eat." That similar vein, you are the media you consume. So what we're taking in, we're also spitting out, where it's a mirror to society, right? This is very different from communications and how NGOs look at a comms function. Narrative strategy is extremely important, and comms is a tool to help shape that narrative strategy, but it is not the same as, okay, I want to work at narrative, I'm going to hire a social media person.
Right.
This is essentially, we're missing the entire point of the infrastructure of what we need to succeed. And actually the right wing is very good at this. They understand the power of narrative. They're putting billions into it. That's how they're winning the propaganda machine right now.
Welcome back to the Campaign Strategist. Today we are talking with Shilpi Chhotray, an internationally recognized media strategist, storyteller, and movement builder dedicated to advancing environmental justice. Shilpi is the co-founder and president of Counterstream Media, which focuses on storytelling initiatives that center frontline voices. And she recently launched a climate justice podcast series for The Nation called A People's Climate. Congratulations on that. Shilpi also writes Narrative Edit, a newsletter exploring the intersection of power, media, and resistance. We will include links to Shilpi's work in the notes. And before we jump in, if you like this conversation and this subject and want to get more, please do take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the Campaign Strategist so you can get noticed every time we have a new episode. Shilpi, welcome to the Campaign Strategist, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, Pete. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You've been involved in so much. Would you tell us, how did you get into social change activism, the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. My work spans about 15 years now. It feels like a blink of an eye, but it also feels like I've aged about 30 years doing this work, as you probably know well. I got my start in sort of a typical green path. I was very focused on ocean conservation. It was a kind of like a life-changing trip to Australia, to the Great Barrier Reef in Cairns when I was an undergrad in college. I went to Virginia Tech University. Inland, not a lot of ocean there. Undergraduate degree was in environmental science and policy, and I got just swept away with, the beauty and the mystic of the ocean. And I spent a good chunk of my early career in ocean conservation, got a chance to work at Environmental Defense Fund, was my first job out of college. Shout out to Amanda Leland, who now is the head of entire Environmental Defense Fund. She was my first boss and really took a chance on me. I actually just saw her at New York City Climate Week last week, and she gave me a copy of her book. It's called Sea Change. Started reading it. Definitely check it out. She really encouraged me to a couple things. She encouraged me to go to graduate school, and she also encouraged me to look at things that were more interdisciplinary. And she thought I had a knack for communications, and I had no idea what she was talking about at that time. It's funny now because I look back and I've spent, the majority of my career in like a communications focused role. So after spending a solid year and a half at EDF, really looking at marine protected areas, fisheries, largely focused on policy, I went on to graduate school and then had a long history of ocean conservation projects after that, including with Dr. Sylvia Earle at Mission Blue, which was really incredible. I also got to co-author for National Geographic at that time. So again, kind of fine-tuning the communications muscle. So it was kind of a traditional green NGO path, if you will. Had a short stint at NRDC as well in the health program. Yeah, I landed in San Francisco, was one of my first jobs here. Not in the oceans program, but in the health, looking at like carbon black with Diane Bailey and her team. Shortly after the Mission Blue work, I got recruited for an incredible role with the Break Free from Plastic movement, heading communications there. Break Free from Plastic was a bit of like a coming home for me. It's a movement of now over 2,500 groups working all around the world at every point in the plastic pollution life cycle. So from extraction to production to consumption to disposal. And literally my first day on the job was flying to Bali, Indonesia, and meeting with like 200 activists on the ground. And that singular moment changed the trajectory of my career. I was immersed in the fight against plastic pollution, very much so from a human perspective. And the challenge and the opportunity there was communicating it as such. At that point, people were still using the term marine debris. We're not talking about floating sticks in the ocean or the environment. We're talking about a systematic approach to where the plastic is coming from, the petrochemical industry, where it's going through waste colonization. And so that role was really pivotal.
Could I just ask you about waste colonization?
Yes, you can.
Would you just mind defining that term?
Yeah, sure. So waste colonization is essentially when wealthier countries like the United States, which is the top exporter, ships our waste, including a lot of plastic waste, to other countries in the world, largely the global south. We see a lot of this in South Asia, Southeast Asia. Now those countries are pushing back, like Malaysia, Philippines, India, where I'm from originally. And that waste is now being diverted to South America and Africa. So it's very concerning.
Okay.
And this has been going on for a long time. And like that, for me, in particular, because I'm Indian, I'm South Asian, it felt very personal to me in that, why are these communities the dumping ground for the world's waste? People that look like me, and also deserve to live in dignity.
Yeah.
And so the movement is incredible. So Break Free from Plastic, please check out the work, is just so foundational to how I understand systems and power and accountability and how we're telling the broader, at that point, plastic story, but more broadly speaking, the climate story.
I want to ask you more about that effort, that 2,500 groups working together, if we have time. Part of this podcast is about the nuts and bolts of advocacy. How does it work? And just the idea of how do you connect 2,500 groups around the world into meaningful sort of combined action, collective action, is a really interesting question. So
it's a great question. It's a campaigner's question. I love it.
Yeah.
I figured I'd get some questions like this. Yeah, so Break Free from Plastic is incredibly strategic. The movement was launched in Manila, Philippines, so the foundational part of the leadership is grounded in Global South kind of values and infrastructure. There were coordinated bodies also in Europe and in the US, and now we've branched to Africa and South America. So it's a very sophisticated coordination infrastructure where it's local, it's regional, it's national, it's multinational, and then it's global, right? So we are showing up kind of everywhere at all level of policy and campaigning and communications and the legal structures as well. The plastics treaty negotiations just ended a few weeks ago, the INC, where a lot of our organizers have shown up for these multinational legislative bodies of work as well. So we are now, I think how many years are we? We launched Break Free from Plastic back in 2017. I was actually the first staffer. So one of the first staffers, okay. I think the first staffer. So I've been around for a minute, got to help get it off the ground. I'm really, really proud of what the colleagues have been able to do with that work. And there's folks from all sorts of organizations, large and small. Earth Justice is a big part of the success of the, supporting the frontline organizations and their legal and policy wins. And, Oceana is also involved. So there are some bigger groups, but there's also like the Global Alliance for Incinerator Alternatives, thank you, Gaia, which has, they have staff all over the world. So they've been really foundational in getting it off. Center for International Environmental Law. I was hubbed at the Story of Stuff project here in Berkeley for several years. So lots of incredible organizations. Greenpeace, of course, hugely impactful in that space. And then lots of smaller frontline groups too, like Rise St. James, Descendants Project, the Vessel Project, a lot of Gulf South voices. So it was just really rewarding to kind of help, shape that ecosystem of movement muscle. And then I, of course, my focus has always been communications and narrative strategy.
So let's talk about that. So you founded Counterstream Media, which uses journalism and storytelling to challenge harmful narratives and work toward environmental justice. Can you just talk about why is it needed How does it work? And how's it going?
Cool. Yeah. So after Break Free from Plastic, I started People Over Plastic, which is now Counterstream, and it was essentially a exercise in getting more laser focused on the narrative side of things. So I actually launched with a podcast out of my garage after leaving Break Free from Plastic. My first son was 8 months old at the time. There's like photos of him in like a little rocking chair while I'm recording.
Oh,
It was really sweet and also very masochistic to try to start something with
with
an
an
eight
8 month
month
old.
old during the pandemic. Like, hello, but here we are.
Were you
So,
interviewing people for that, or yeah?
oh
So
yeah,
that
yeah.
must have been challenging.
We were interviewing people. My first episode was with Miss Sharon Levine and the artist Von Wong. And that really shaped the course of the next 5 seasons of this podcast. We launched into a little newsroom, and now we're called Counterstream Media, which
Hmm.
has a bunch of narrative projects, including the podcast with the nation, is part of that bigger strategy of narrative intervention. We're not just focused on plastic.
I think that for our movement, the environmental movement, environmental justice movement, to be able to chart a course forward, we have got to get more powerful and more influential. And it seems to me the absolute first step of that is to ramp up our communications game. Because if we can't reach people without audience, we don't have influence. So can you just break down for me though, like there's narrative, there's messaging, how do those fit together? And when you talk about narrative, can you just, what does that mean in this context, and why is narrative so important?
Yeah, and I so appreciate what you said about who's in control on the media, because I want to talk about that with you. And this is so much of why Counterstream was founded, because we are currently not winning the narrative war right now, and there's a lot of need for helping shape. So when I think about narrative, it's the underpinning of our entire society. It's how it shapes policy, it's how it shapes culture, it's how we are communicating our values at the individual level, as families, as a community. I often say this quote: "You are what you eat." That similar vein, you are the media you consume. So what we're taking in, we're also spitting out, where it's a mirror to society, right? This is very different from communications and how NGOs look at a comms function. Narrative strategy is extremely important, and comms is a tool to help shape that narrative strategy, but it is not the same as, okay, I want to work at narrative, I'm going to hire a social media person. That
Right.
This is essentially, we're missing the entire point of the infrastructure of what we need to succeed. And actually the right wing is very good at this. They understand the power of narrative. They're putting billions into it. That's how they're winning the propaganda machine right now. And this is so much of why we wanted to create a people's climate, which is the show I'm producing and hosting for the nation. And we need more legacy institutions like the nation, for instance. They've been around since 1865. Okay, so they know what they're doing. And they're one of the few Western legacy institutions that are very hard hitting and nail it on progressive journalism. There's not a lot of media institutions I trust or would even consider partnering with, but this has absolutely been a dream for us. I think, Pete, if I can, I'll just love to name a couple
Sure.
stats here
Yeah.
for your listeners. So, and maybe they already know this, because I know you're very passionate about the narrative work, but I'm hyper cognizant that in the US, 6 conglomerates control the majority of mainstream media outlets. So when we're thinking about climate, that means stories about climate and justice are filtered through these profit-driven models. And right now we have an administration that's banning words like clean energy, right? This just came out in
And climate.
Politico.
Yeah.
It's
And
wild. It's
diversity.
like it's the whole thing is being dismantled, and there's
Yeah.
a lot of money going behind the narrative piece of it.
What's an example of a narrative? Like the way I think about it is it's sort of the extended story that you're trying to tell that is a framework for contextualizing all of the sort of more day-to-day communications you might engage in. Is that a good way to look at it, or how, and I don't know. I just love examples. So like
Yeah.
if you have a handy example of narrative versus, a message of the day kind of thing.
So I will say, like, there's a reason why independent people powered media is essential to our very democracy. So it shifts the center of gravity from the boardrooms, for instance, to the neighborhoods that are most impacted. And those are the stories that we're most interested in, is like who's not making headlines, but really moving the needle on systems change.
Hmm.
A tangible example is Diane Wilson's decades long fight in Seadrift, Texas. Texas Gulf South is like the home of petrochemicals. We know this from
Yep.
Louisiana's Cancer Alley to Houston's Ship State Channel. This is like ground zero for plastic production. And she waged a fight against Formosa Plastic, which is a $250 petrochemical industry, which is originally from Taiwan. So get this,
Hmm.
this is like almost reverse waste colonization, but it was like this
Yeah. Yeah.
billion-dollar petrochemical polluting factory was too polluting for Taiwan, so they came to Texas, and they're trying to do the same thing in New Orleans, Louisiana. But of course, Miss Sharon Levine won't let that happen. But in Diane's case, the Formosa plant was polluting these little plastic pellets,
Hmm.
also known as nurdles. And it's also a red state. So like the politics of this is glaring. She's a fifth generation shrimp farmer. Her family has been fishing in the bays there for decades, for generations. And for 2.5 years, she collected the pellets, thousands of them, and put them in mason jars, documenting it. And this is her story and how she won a $50 million settlement against Formosa. So, these are the stories we desperately need right now, stories of solutions, of grassroots communities that are putting power back into the hands of the people. And that's essentially what a people's climate is all about. And I will also say the $50 million settlement, she didn't take a cent. She put all that money back into her community to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Oh, that's amazing.
And this is the stuff that I don't want to spoil, but she's also the co-founder of Code Pink, which is like one of the biggest anti-war groups in the country. She's
Yeah.
like been vocal against the genocide in Gaza for 2 years. She's a co-founder of that massive platform. She's also the co-founder of the Texas Jails Project. So she's not just a plastic pollution activist. She's not just an environmentalist. She is at the core of it, fighting for systems change with a strong social justice lens. And this is why I brought her on the show, because everybody knows her story about Formosa. Any environmentalist you talk to, they know who Miss Diane Wilson is. They know who Miss Sharon Levine is. I've known Miss Diane for several years now. I never heard this side of her story. Okay, why did you find this anti-war organization? Why was that important to you? Why was it important to you to start in an organization that helped women from the inside of jails, of county jails? And so I've just been so honestly humbled by the way folks have opened up on this season with me and my team, and really sharing kind of intimate details of their life for hopefully millions of people to hear.
Yeah.
and,
Yeah. Absolutely.
and that's like how we shift the narrative.
Yeah.
It's strategic why I brought Miss Diane on, because I knew she would come at this from a human perspective that's not just about science and data. We
Yep.
know that we have the numbers. In order to move the needle, we need to move the hearts and minds, on the narrative piece.
And that's about the narrative is this stuff
Yeah.
hurts people. It hurts their health. It hurts their economic viability. It harms the communities that we live in, as that sort of broad narrative. And then these stories fit into that.
Exactly.
In terms of what are the lessons that you've been learning about sort of how to craft narrative strategy or how to help groups figure out what their narrative strategy is? Tell me about that. Like, what's that entail?
Well, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg, because a lot of organizations, especially the climate NGOs, I call it the nonprofit industrial complex, which is neither here or there because I'm a part of it. But it's like, honestly, that starts with the philanthropies, really understanding the need of movement media, narrative muscle, supporting, the infrastructure that can provide even like a baseline to start working on this stuff. And we're really far off from that. I'm also, just overwhelmingly frustrated with where climate philanthropy dollars are going. My friend who was on the, I'm not going to say a name, but my whistleblower friend that was on the inside of a major climate philanthropy sent me a report that I studied. And I'll just say, we're not putting the money in the right places. And a lot of the money from climate philanthropy is going to false solutions. About 60 million went to carbon capture, which is crazy. And it's been highly criticized by especially frontline organizers for not being it's a greenwashing solution.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
a greenwashing tactic, right? And we're only giving 2% to environmental justice
Yeah,
and just
yeah.
transition work, and then even less, not even a 1% is going to narrative and media strategy. So we're also one of the few organizations, I will say my team is amazing, that really understand narrative infrastructure and also are deeply embedded in the movement work. Often you have like incredible movement media organizations that are more traditional newsrooms, which we desperately need.
Hmm.
But we bridge the gap, and we have deep relationships with communities doing the work on the ground. And then we also understand like editorially how it works for production. And again, like building that scaffolding for people to even tell their stories, but in a way that's going to reach new audiences.
I'm really interested in that piece in particular, the way I've thought about how do we address our communications problem. And it is such a massive problem. And I work with mostly the larger organizations. And I think that we have not really articulated a long-term vision of what we're going for. Like Anat Shenker says all the time, if you want more people to come to your party, you got to throw a better party. And that's part
Brilliant.
of talking about you've got to like lay out something that people want to be a part of, not to go all the way down just the one rabbit hole, but like articulating a broad vision. I think there's tens of millions conservatively of Americans who support at least some environmental aspect, some aspect of the environmental world, whether it's like land conservation or clean energy or just air pollution, clean water. But we really don't reach and engage that many people. So we've got to broaden our audience. And then one of the biggest, in some ways, those things are sort of academic. I think the biggest challenge is then in today's media environment, we are really in a war over volume, and the sheer mass of content that the right wing generates, which then the algorithms recognize there's all this stuff coming up on immigration or crime or whatever it is they want to talk about. And then the algorithms favor that content even more. And we are way behind. One of the things I've been thinking about is there a way to work with and support frontline organizations, local groups, to help them tell their stories about what they're dealing with, and to help them tell it on a regular basis. And so I'm really interested in what you've been finding in your work so far with that. What does it take? How do you help them tell their own stories? What kind of infrastructure does that take? Like I said, this is a nuts and bolts show.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is exactly why we exist, right? Because the stories that need to be told, I fundamentally believe that, race and class and culture are the biggest pieces that are missing in the climate conversation. And it's not just the right-wing media. Like the broader climate movement has, and I just wrote a piece about this, is what we call blind spots. It's like, great, you care about land conservation, but do you care about Black folks that are being poisoned by petrochemicals on supposed land? People don't want to talk about race and class and socioeconomic status. They don't want to talk about petrochemicals. Okay, why are these petrochemicals in these neighborhoods? Because of racial redlining. Okay, why do we have racial redlining? Because of segregation. Why did we have segregation? Because of slavery and colonization. Fundamentally, if we don't address these things, why would communities that have been facing generations of trauma, but who also have the solutions, be willing to work with groups that want to help tell their stories? So fundamentally, I think the whole thing needs to be examined very closely. And this is also why Counterstream People Over Plastic, A People's Climate, we have taken some steps back from the broader climate movement, and I'm really honest about that because I'm not happy with the direction the climate movement is going, and a lot of the groups we work with feel the same way, and we're here to expose those sort of blind spots, if
Yeah,
you will.
yeah.
And so, for me personally, like our community, our relationships are everything. There's a lot of trust that goes into having the privilege of even being in a position to build the infrastructure to help folks be able to tell their stories or share their stories and amplify them in a way that has a lot of nuance and integrity to these stories and the vulnerability that comes with it too. I mean, these are not easy topics to
Yeah.
share with people that don't want to listen about the harder things. And this is essentially why with the People's Climate, we're trying to get people to understand this is not just a climate fight. It's fundamentally about our democracy, if that helps.
Well, I want you to say more about that. And then I'm also really interested in that question of what does it look like when you build that infrastructure or work with frontline groups to build the infrastructure?
We've been at this for a while, and my roots are really from my time at the Break Free from Plastic movement. And we started People Over Plastic Now Counterstream back in 2021. I actually just texted our co-founder, Patrice Sims, a few days ago. It was our 4-year anniversary as co-pilots of this org. Patrice is also the VP of litigation at Earth Justice. So shout out
Well, I knew him when he was at
Patrice.
NRDC, and
That's what he said.
And all the way back when I was working on power plants, he was like one of those people who really knew everything that I could call up and go, wait, now how does this work? And with this plant, yeah, I love Patrice.
He's the best. He's like so just probably the smartest person I know and like the most amazing mentor. And yeah,
That's great.
he comes at this from, he's a lawyer,
Yeah.
he's a legal advocate. He's, worked under the Obama administration. So he's seen a lot. And he fundamentally thinks like storytelling is how we're going to move the needle. Also, these stories help shape like what legal projects and policies, how those take shape as well. So there's a lot of connective tissue there. We've been really lucky to also work with Earth Justice on a number of different events and projects. But to answer your question, so what does building the narrative infrastructure look like? So you really have to understand like where your target audience is. And I often start with who's our audience, who are we speaking to, really understanding them down to like, do they prefer Target or, a little mom and pop shop? Like, where are they shopping? What are they reading? What are they listening to? Really understanding that. And that can be different from project to project. For us, our demographic is organizers of color. It's, folks of color that have influence in, shaping democracy, if you will, and really kind of the marriage of those two. And what I was finding in the earlier years is that a lot of the social justice and racial justice activists that I was in community with in here in Oakland, and we live in a little bit of a bubble in Oakland, but an amazing community here. A lot of my friends and colleagues in more of the social and racial justice spaces didn't know about Cancer Alley. They didn't know about petrochemicals. And then once they started hearing about it, they're like, well, this is our fight too. They just never felt welcomed to the environmental movement.
Yeah.
And there were so many times, especially after George Floyd was tragically killed for the world to see, I would ask my friends, I really want to get more involved in your work and your fights. Can I use my communication skills and shift gears? They're like, no, stay where you are, bring these fights to the environmental work. We need more intersection there. So I took their advice, had a couple of friends in mind. I remember we sat social distance in my backyard. We're all like bawling, crying after what we were witnessing with George Floyd.
Yeah.
And I was pregnant at the time, and I was literally like, I'll do anything. What can I do to use my platform or whatever skills I have? And they literally were like, stay the track, just bring this into that space. And so I didn't really look back. The infrastructure, again, to your point, is like understanding where your audience is, meeting them where they're at, and then
Hmm.
finding what's like authentic to your brand and your voice. And I will say I'm really proud of our team. We haven't really compromised on how hard hitting we've been on, the race and class piece in all of the environmental
Yeah.
conversations we've had.
Well, you put your finger on an important point a few minutes ago, and that is white people don't like to talk about race and class. It's
I don't
like,
know why.
it's,
Like we all, it's foundational to society.
it is.
It's an important point to name. Actually, Reverend Barber III talks a lot about this. He's an amazing thought leader on this exactly.
Well, and there was a lot of, I mean, certainly in the spaces where I was, and after George Floyd in that summer, there was a lot of focus and talk, and I guess in some organizations, some self-analysis. What's happening with that conversation now? Because the environment is so hostile to
Yeah.
this conversation, from the federal government going after environmental justice groups, trying to remove anything that has anything to do with justice, diversity, equity.
Science,
Yeah, right.
right?
Well,
Like
science, right, and then in more,
women's rights.
and a lot of companies have been sort of stepping back. Is this also setting back is there a conversation in the mainstream environmental movement about the relationship between race and class and the environmental agenda, or has it like is that are people pulling back from it now just because of the overall political environment? Where are we with this these days?
I don't think, to your point, that we've ever talked about race and class in the environmental movement. I mean, there were some, black squares that went out when George Floyd was killed. There was some soul searching, people were hired to do internal navigation within orgs, but fundamentally, I don't think much has shifted in that conversation. Now, race and class is talked about as the norm, as the baseline in environmental justice circles,
Of course, yeah.
right? So that is probably not surprising, but in the broader climate space, certainly not. I don't think we were doing a good job before, though,
No,
to
no,
that
we
point.
weren't. We definitely weren't. I also want to hear more about, you said you're kind of stepping away from the central climate conversation. What does that mean in terms of like what conversations are you removing? Are there conversations you're removing yourself from?
I like the question because it's more philosophical, and I can be a little bit philosophical sometimes, but but there's a logistical part of it too. So philosophically, my values for a long time have not aligned with the mainstream climate movement. And I've had to sort of chart our own lane, which is why we call the organization Counterstream,
Downstream, yeah.
right? Because it's not quite the mainstream media or the mainstream climate movement. It's the counter narrative, which is, from our perspective, more powerful and needs more visibility. So, values aligned, I simply am finding more joy and strategic partnerships elsewhere. What that means is with more movement media folks like The Nation, like
Hmm.
Prism, which is an incredible journalism organization led by journalists of color. It means deepening partnerships with frontline folks, with media makers of color. We just had a story salon at Climate Week with Frontline Resources Institute, which is Margot Brown's team. She's actually at EDF, but she also runs Frontline Resources Institute. So, really being strategic where we foster our partnerships
Yeah.
because there's like a baseline of understanding where I don't even have to address race and class. It's just fundamentally understood and we can go and do our work, right? And then the logistical part of it is I don't have the time. I don't have the time to
Yeah.
waste. There's so much at stake. There's only so many hours in the day. I'm a mother of two, right? Like where is the most high impact strategically that is going to move the needle? I just don't have time to waste. And this is exactly how many of my people that we work with also feel.
Well, that seems like a really That seems like a far-sighted strategy to me, because instead of basically banging your head and trying to get the mainstream environmental movement to pay more attention, you're focusing on, okay, how do I build up the power and the influence and the strength of this community that has been neglected again and again, so that it becomes a force to be reckoned with. At which point, presumably then there will be more attention and actual engagement from the mainstream environmental groups, and I'm going to guess funders.
I don't care so much about the mainstream environmental groups. I really don't. It's where the philanthropy money is. And unfortunately, the stranglehold is to the mainstream environmental groups. So yeah, it's a bottleneck right now. I mean, I just talked to Ms. Sharon Levine about this. We had breakfast in New York, and we're so frustrated that the big greens are holding the money to disseminate to the frontline groups or even media orgs like ours. The philanthropy should just be working directly in resourcing, definitely my priority is always to resource the frontline groups first. Mm-hmm. Resource them to get their own comms people. But again, as we've talked, that's different from narrative infrastructure. It's different from moving the media and building the media muscle. And that's kind of that second tier where we live. Obviously, we want to be resourced too, right? But we want to be resourced so we can, be really smart and agile how we tell those stories. And not that we're telling, but sharing those stories.
I would love to keep talking with you. This has been really interesting, and I still have many questions, but our time is drawing to a close. So I want to ask you my standard last question, which is, what is a lesson learned or a piece of advice that you got early in your career that has really been valuable to you and that you'd like to share with others?
That's a good question. I have a mentor, Judith Inc., who maybe some of y'all know. She runs Beyond Plastics, former U.S. EPA administration employee, but she's incredible. We really worked closely together while I was at Break Free from Plastic. I'm actually talking to her next week, but she said to me once, "Shilpi, you have to do what makes your heart sing." And it was so simple and so poignant. That's essentially the next week I was I'm leaving Break Free. I'm going to start People Over Plastic, I think people were a little surprised, but yeah.
That's a great piece of advice.
Appreciate Judith's advice. And now when I mentor a lot of, mostly young women of color in our broader field, but I tell them the same thing. When they're at a inflection point or a crisis point, as they often share, it's very simple but beautiful advice.
Yeah. Well, hats off to you. I'm really impressed and amazed at
thank you.
How you're thinking about this stuff and the work that you're doing, and really appreciate what you're doing. So thank you. And thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Pete. I hope this is the first of future conversations.
Me too. Well, it definitely will be, because I definitely do want to follow up with you.
Good.
Thanks for tuning into the Campaign Strategist, where we dive into the art and science of advocacy. The podcast is produced by Prismatic Strategies to share wisdom and insights from leaders in the field. I'm your host, Pete Altman. Music was written by Andrea Perry and Pete Altman, and this is edited by Abby Altman. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who care about making a difference. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. Thanks again, and see you next time.